Welcome back. Welcome back. We live in an era of huge multinational corporations, from McDonald's to Microsoft to BP. Giant companies, often described as too big to fail. They dominate our lives. But is that a good thing or a bad thing? And what does too big to fail really mean anyway? After all, partly thanks to name changes, mergers and bankruptcies, only one company listed 50 years ago in the Fortune 500 list is one of the world's biggest today. That's how it all changes. One man who's been charting the changes, the rise and the fall of corporations is Andrew Sims, Policy Director of the New Economic Foundation. And he joins me now. Welcome. Just one preface as we lead into these things. It is basically your view that in terms of the world that people all around the world live in, supermarkets are too big, too powerful.
I think we've seen over the last 20 years far too much of the control over our overall food chain fall into the hands of far too few companies. You now have a situation where just 4 shops in Great Britain, and the same is mirrored in many of the other sort of advanced industrialised countries, a handful of companies controlling what gets grown, what gets sold, what gets eaten, how it gets distributed. And that means you end up with very vulnerable food supply chains, and it means that the small producers, the small farmers, and even some of the medium-sized ones are always in hock to what the big supermarkets tell them. And it's ended up hollowing out our economies, and it's ended up leaving farmers at the whim of the supermarket executives.
I see what you mean by that, but on the other hand, not to have them, I mean, Tesco's or around the world, spreading around the world, but take Tesco for example, they are more efficient than the small round the corner shop.
One of the problems is that when we talk about the efficiency of the big supermarkets, we have to know what that means. Now, of course, efficiency to Tesco's means employing fewer people to do the same amount of jobs. So when you get one large superstore open on the edge of town or out of town, you see a net destruction of jobs, of employment, of about 270 people. The other efficiency, of course, is that when you go into your supermarket, less of the money you spend actually stays and recirculates in your local economy. It gets whisked off to the remote headquarters to pay the distant shareholders who don't really care what happens to your local economy. So their definition of efficiency is how to make a lot of money for very few people.
We were just quoting earlier on, only one company has survived on the Fortune 500 for 50 years. In 50 years' time, will Microsoft be there? Will all the other names be there?
You need diversity in the marketplace to have stability. At the moment, the trend is still towards more concentration into ever fewer hands, and that will leave us very, very vulnerable. We need more diversity. We need to break up, effectively, these big companies if we're going to have a more stable economy, and if we're not going to be in a situation again when, ironically, the free market comes and asks the taxpayer to bail it out.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Let's go and have a coffee at Starbucks.
There's a nice independent round the corner.
It's a feud that has been played out in the full glare of Russia's media. But this week, after months of indecision, President Medvedev finally sacked the mayor of Moscow, one of the big beasts, Yuri Luzhkov. President Medvedev claimed he had lost confidence in one of the big beasts of Russian politics, a man who had been running Moscow for nearly 2 decades. But was it a sign of strength, the sacking, or weakness? I'm joined now by one of the world's best authorities on Russia today, author of the book The New Cold War, Edward Lucas. Edward, welcome, welcome. But this has been rumbling before it actually burst into the public gaze, that this controversy between the mayor of Moscow on the one hand and the forces against him.
Absolutely, and it's always been a bit of a puzzle how the national authorities in Russia were going to rub along with Yuri Luzhkov, who really is not just the mayor of Moscow, he's the chief executive of Moscow Inc. His wife is the richest woman in Russia. She has a very big construction business with a lot of municipal contracts, all perfectly legal, and no one's saying anything wrong about it, but she has become very rich while her husband has been mayor. And he's very popular in Moscow. Muscovites really like him. And the Kremlin, of course, really likes to have everything under its own control. And I think that Luzhkov overreached himself when he started trying to split the Medvedev-Putin duo. He seemed to be trying to play one off against the other, and I think that's why, in the end, he got whacked.
And which of them was the most furious, do you think? Do you think it was Medvedev, or do you think Putin, the power behind the scenes until he's back in the front of the scenes again after 6 years or whatever? Who was the power behind this happening? Was it Medvedev flexing his power more than he has done in the past, or was it Putin manipulating?
Well, it certainly looks a bit like that, and one could say that this is Medvedev who has been going on and on and on about corruption over the last few years and saying that Russia has to be run better, it needs to be cleaner and more democratic and more legal and all the rest of it. And here you've got a guy who epitomizes corruption or questions about corruption and so on. And so Medvedev is finally practicing what he preaches after a very disappointing period of lots of jaw and no war against corruption. But I think actually that's probably not the case. I think this is really Putin actually giving the instruction and Medvedev doing the whacking, because what Lushkov did was to cast doubt on the authority of the presidency. And of course Putin wants that presidency. He wants to come back and be president when he finishes being prime minister in 2012.
So it was probably he was behind the situation. Was Lushkov in fact corrupt, or you mentioned the word corruption as a maybe there? Was he corrupt?
Well, it was a kind of municipal capitalism where the boundaries between private and public were very blurred and there was very little transparency. And you used to see these skyscrapers going up over Russia, all over Moscow, with a sign out saying, paid for by the extra budgetary funds of the city of Moscow. And the extra budgetary funds were the mayor's personal slush funds. And Muscovites quite like that. They like the big ego, the big buildings, the sense of development, the sense that Moscow was becoming a much more glitzy, a much more go-ahead sort of city. Of course, a lot of it was questionable in terms of taste and in ethics. Beautiful old buildings got knocked down overnight. There was very sort of wild, ruthless sort of property speculation going on. But I think in a free and fair election, I think Lushkov would have been re-elected. And what's very interesting about this is the tactics used to get him out brought real politics back into the Russian media. We actually saw a real discussion about corruption as the central authorities turned on Lushkov. And we had language being used and faces appearing on television that we don't normally see. So it was just for a moment, it was a kind of breath of fresh air of real politics. There's an interesting article in the Russian press today saying that Lushkov sits on a lot of compromat, a lot of blackmail material about people at the top of Russia, and that if he's pushed too far, he might start retaliating. And some people say that he may even become an opposition figure, which would be very interesting to see whether the Russian Democrats, who pride themselves on their squeaky clean image, would like to have this rather powerful but in some ways rather questionable ally.
Well, we'll look at that as the next stage in this installment. Thank you very much, Edward, for being with us. Look forward to catching up with you again soon. Gina Davis will join me in just a moment.